like to tell you about an amusing experience I had when I was transferred from one instructor squadron in Corpus Christi over here to one at Pensacola. And shortly after I got there, I think the chief flight instructor, who was a nice guy, wanted to kind of feel me out and see just what I could do or could not do. So he asked me if I would like to have a few dogfights with him sometime. And I told him I'd be glad to, and he set it all up. So we had the fight out there one day. We met. I didn't have anyone else in my car, my plane, which incidentally were SNJs, the current plane we were using in that squadron. But he had one of the flight instructors with him to observe from the back seat, and we had a nice time with one fight after another. And the way the fights were conducted, we would fly. We got up pretty high, maybe about 30 or 40,000 feet, and would fly toward each other with 1,000-foot distance between the upper plane and the lower plane, and fly right overhead of each other. And when we crossed, the fight was on. And if you know anything about this, the upper flight has what was called the altitude advantage, and he would get to turn either way he wanted to, because he could use the altitude and dive and gain speed and get back on the other man's tail. So whenever he would cross and he would turn to the right, the down on the bottom had to turn to the left, so that when they passed, they would be doing it head on, not the other man having an easy shot at getting on his tail. Because when one got on the other's tail, that fight was over. He had won and conceded, and a new flight was begun. So we did it that way, and for some reason, every fight, we've had about, I think, about a half a dozen flights, and every one, when we were alternating with the altitude advantage, every time he had the altitude advantage, I was still able to fly defensively enough to where he never could get on my tail, and I would either end up winning or we would get in an endless tail chase and just call the particular flight a draw, and start a new one, alternating who had the altitude advantage. When the day was over, we had about, I think, about a half a dozen fights, and I had won every one of them. The ones that I had the altitude advantage, and I either won or tied. The ones that he had the altitude advantage. And we rocked wings and called it a day, and went down and landed, and both thanked each other for a nice fight. And the flight surgeon who was riding in the back seat of his plane said he enjoyed watch my plane with the wind, the sunlight reflecting on it was a beautiful sight, and he enjoyed the whole thing. And with that, we split. So I walked over to the instructor's ready room, and several of the instructors over there were waiting to get a report, and they said, "How did you make out with your dog fights?" And I thought, what's the use for me bragging? I don't need anything to look good at his disadvantage. So I said, well, we had about a half a dozen dog fights, and all of them were pretty even. And I thought he could fly very well and enjoyed it very much. And with that, I left. And he had been watching me secretly from around the corner of the building or something, and he saw me interview that group of instructors. I think, in trying to think back, he was worried about whether I was over there running him down as somebody who wasn't very good, and it would lose him respect from all the other instructors there. And I kind of lurked in the background too to see what happened. And he went over there and interviewed them. And he said, would you tell me how my fight went off with Lieutenant Pace? And they said to him, all he said was he had a bunch of even fights and he thought you were a very good pilot. And with that, he left and everybody left and everybody was happy. And they did what I say and what I thought was true. And I didn't tell them, though, about a little altitude advantage I had, because I had come across a little advantage you can have in a dogfight like that. And that is about like this. Very often, if nobody gets on the other's tail after the change of altitude, and you get down there to the same altitude, it goes into a tail chase, a tight turning contest to see if one of man can turn tighter and get on the tail, or the other man can defend long enough till you call it a draw. And that's what we did on all the tails for chases that I didn't have the advantage. And he rocked his wings and I rocked mine, and that fight was over. And we came down and landed, and each one shook hands and thanked the other for a lot of fun. The flight surgeon came over and told me how much he had enjoyed watching the dogfights with the sunlight flashing on my wing when I would turn. He thought it was a beautiful sight, and we all had a good time. And the climax to the song, I think, did I tell you about my secret advantage? I had come across a secret advantage into a dogfight that I used against the commanding officer, and it gave me quite an advantage. And it was this: when we had scissored, that's what you call going like this, a few times, we would end up in a tight tail chase, and each one trying to get on the other's tail, and that takes smooth fighting, flying, and tight turning. But I had learned that if you're as tight as the plane will go, you can let that plane pull just a little tighter into a spin, and it'll lurch, but you mustn't allow it to actually spin, or you'd lose. It would spin, and he'd come down, and you would lose. But it would lurch, it would yawn on him in that double turn we were making, and stopped turning and stopped the spin tendency, and I would have gained cutting across that arc. And I did that once or twice if necessary, and first thing you know, I was on his tail, right there, big as there. And nothing he could do, nothing anybody could do. The fight was up, and he would rock wings, the flight is over. And after that happened, every time I had the altitude advantage, and nothing, when he had it, that's when we went down and landed and called it a day. But there was one more angle to the story, if I could tell without appearing immodest, and that was a day or two later. I was a new man to that squadron, but I had a parking space right by the front door with my name on it. and everybody was always nice to me. I never told them the truth, and we were always friends, and I felt good that I had not intentionally or not made him look bad before his other instructors. And that's the story.